It's Thursday morning in November, somewhere in America. The house smells like butter and sage. Your grandmother's rolling out pie crust with the same wooden pin she's used for 40 years. Your uncle's arguing about football in the living room. Kids are stealing marshmallows off the sweet potato casserole when no one's looking. This is Thanksgiving, the way most of us know it, the way we've always known it. A day for family, for gratitude, for tradition, and we learned the story when we were young. In class, you were asked to craft pilgrim hats from black construction paper. Maybe you wore a paper feather headband as she began to tell the story. The Pilgrims sailed across a dangerous ocean on a ship called the Mayflower. They entered a land that was brutal, strange, and hostile. At first, winter was brutal, cold and unforgiving. Many of them died, but then the Native Americans came. They were kind and generous. They taught the Pilgrims how to plant corn, to fish, and to survive in this strange new land. And in the fall of 1621, after a successful harvest, everyone came together. Pilgrims and Indians. They shared a great feast. Turkey, corn, pumpkin. They gave thanks for their friendship, for the harvest, for peace. It was the first Thanksgiving. That's the story, isn't it? Simple, beautiful, comforting. It's also one of the most dangerous lies ever told to American children. Because the real story, the true story, isn't about friendship and turkey dinners. It's about the systematic destruction of entire civilizations, the deaths of millions, the theft of a continent. And somehow, we turned it into a holiday about gratitude. Let's start before the beginning. Before the Mayflower. Before Plymouth Rock. Before any European ever set foot on these shores. The land we now call New England was not empty. It was not wilderness waiting to be tamed. It was densely populated, carefully managed. Home to hundreds of thousands of people, organized into dozens of sophisticated nations. The Wampanoag Confederacy controlled much of what is now Massachusetts and Rhode Island, 67 villages, over 12,000 people. To the north, the Massachusetts, the Pawtucket, the Abenaki. To the west, the Nipmuc. To the south, the Narragansett, the Pequot, the Mohegan. These were not simple societies. They had complex political structures, trade networks that stretched hundreds of miles, agricultural systems that had been perfected over thousands of years. The Wampanoag didn't just hunt and gather. They managed the land, controlled burns to prevent wildfires, and encouraged new growth. They practiced selective harvesting to sustain the land, planting corn, beans, and squash in the indigenous system known as the Three Sisters, where each crop supported the others and renewed the soil. They had laws, diplomacy, art, music, oral histories that preserved thousands of years of knowledge. They had names for every river, every hill, every bend in the coastline. This was their home, had been for 10,000 years. And then, nothing was ever the same again. The Mayflower wasn't the first ship, not even close. For over a century before the Pilgrims arrived, European explorers, fishermen, and traders had been visiting these shores, taking resources, but also kidnapping people. In 1524, an Italian explorer named Giovanni da Verrazzano kidnapped an indigenous child from what is now Rhode Island. In 1614, 6 years before the Pilgrims, an English captain named Thomas Hunt lured 27 Wampanoag and Nauset people onto his ship. Using trade as a pretext, they sailed to Spain and sold them into enslavement. One of those men was named Tisquantum. You might know him as Squanto. He spent 5 years enslaved in Europe, eventually escaped to England, learned English, and finally made it back to his homeland in 1619, just months before the Mayflower arrived. When Tisquantum returned to his village of Pawtucket, everyone was dead, not killed in battle, not scattered by war, dead from disease. European diseases had been ravaging the coast for years. Fishermen would stop to trade. Explorers would make contact. And they'd leave behind invisible death. Smallpox, leptospirosis, hepatitis, measles, typhus, plague. Native people of the Americas had no immunity to these diseases. None. Their bodies had never encountered them before. Between 1616 and 1619, a plague swept through coastal New England. We still don't know exactly what it was, likely a combination of leptospirosis and hepatitis, introduced by European rats and livestock. It killed somewhere between 50 and 90% of the coastal population. Let me put that in perspective. Imagine 90% of everyone you know dying within 3 years. Your parents, your children, your siblings, your friends, your neighbors. Entire villages were wiped out. Bodies piled up faster than survivors could bury them. Fields went unplanted. Families were shattered. The social fabric that held communities together disintegrated. The Wampanoag called it the Great Dying. The English called it Providence, God clearing the land for them. By the time the Mayflower arrived in December 1620, the landscape was a graveyard. Villages stood empty, their inhabitants dead or fled. Corn stores rotted in abandoned fields. Their bones lay abandoned, unclaimed and unburied. And the Pilgrims saw it as a miracle, a gift from God. The Pilgrims were desperate. They'd left England as religious separatists, spent years in Holland, and finally secured funding for a voyage to the New World. They were supposed to land near the Hudson River, in territory controlled by the Virginia Company. Instead, storms pushed them north to Cape Cod. They arrived in winter. Wrong season, wrong place. Completely unprepared. The Mayflower anchored in what is now Provincetown Harbor on November 11, 1620. A scouting party went ashore and immediately started stealing. They found corn buried by the Wampanoag, seeds saved for spring, and they took it. They found graves and dug them up, stealing the goods buried with the dead. They acknowledged it even in their own journals. William Bradford, later governor of Plymouth Colony, recorded it without remorse. They needed food, and they took it. The Pilgrims eventually settled at a site they called Plymouth, but that place already had a name, Patuxet. It was Tisquantum's home, the village where everyone had died. The Pilgrims built their colony on top of a mass grave. That first winter was brutal. The Pilgrims were starving, freezing, dying of scurvy and pneumonia. By spring, half of them were dead. Of the 102 passengers who'd left England, only 53 survived. And then, in March 1621, a man walked into their settlement and spoke to them in English. His name was Samoset, and he was visiting Wampanoag territory on a diplomatic mission. A few days later, he returned with Tisquantum, the man who'd been kidnapped, enslaved, and returned only to find his entire world destroyed. Everyone he's ever known is dead. His village is gone. And now there are English colonists living on the graves of his people, the same kind of people who enslaved him. And he helps them survive, not out of naive kindness, not because of some Disney-level generosity, but because he was caught between two worlds and survival required adaptation. Tisquantum had his own agenda. He'd been gone for 5 years. The political landscape had completely changed. The plague had devastated the Wampanoag, leaving them vulnerable to their traditional enemies, particularly the Narragansett to the south. And now these English settlers were here, with guns and metal tools. Tisquantum saw an opportunity. He could broker an alliance between the Wampanoag and the English, strengthening his own position in the process. In March 1621, he arranged a meeting between the Pilgrims and Massasoit, the leader of the Wampanoag Confederacy. Massasoit was nobody's fool. He'd watched the plague destroy his people. He'd seen English ships kidnap his men. He knew exactly what he was dealing with. But the Wampanoag were weak. The Narragansett were strong and threatening. These English had weapons. So Massasoit made a calculated decision, a political alliance, a mutual defense pact. The Wampanoag would help the Pilgrims survive. In exchange, the Pilgrims would be military allies against the Narragansett, and Tisquantum became the intermediary and the bridge between these two worlds. He taught the Pilgrims to plant corn using fish as fertilizer. He showed them which plants were edible, where to fish, how to navigate the terrain. The Pilgrims didn't survive that first year because of rugged individualism or divine intervention. They survived because indigenous people saved them. And in the fall of 1621, after a successful harvest, there was indeed a feast. Here's what we know from the primary sources. It lasted 3 days. About 50 pilgrims attended. Massasoit brought 90 Wampanoag warriors, deliberately outnumbering the English. They ate venison and 5 deer brought by the Wampanoag. Shellfish, corn, no turkey and no cranberry sauce. And no pumpkin pie. This wasn't Thanksgiving. The Pilgrims didn't call it that. They didn't celebrate it annually. It wasn't some magical moment of harmony. It was a political gathering, a demonstration of alliance, a show of force on both sides. The Pilgrims practiced Thanksgivings as days of prayer and fasting, rather than celebratory meals. When they declared official days of Thanksgiving, it was to thank God for things like victory in battle, the safe return of someone from a journey, or the successful slaughter of their enemies. Massasoit kept the peace for 40 years. 40 years of fragile coexistence, while more and more English settlers poured in. But peace was only possible as long as both sides needed each other. And with every ship that arrived, the balance shifted. By 1630, just 10 years after the Pilgrims landed, 17 ships arrived carrying 1,000 Puritan settlers. They founded Boston. By 1640, New England was home to roughly 20,000 English colonists. The land that had supported dozens of indigenous nations for thousands of years was suddenly claimed as property. The English brought a concept of land ownership that was completely foreign to the Wampanoag. In indigenous culture, land was communal. You couldn't own a river any more than you could own the sky. But the English had pieces of paper, deeds, purchases. And here's the thing about those purchases. They were almost always fraudulent. English colonists would buy land through deliberately confusing transactions. They exchanged gifts such as cloth and metal tools, occasionally alcohol, and treated the exchange as a land transaction. They'd have native leaders sign documents written in English that said something completely different than what was verbally agreed. Or they'd just forge the documents entirely. And when native people protested, when they said, "We never agreed to sell our land," the English had the law, the guns, and the numbers to ignore them. With every passing year, native people were pushed further from their ancestral lands. Hunting grounds they'd used for generations were suddenly off limits, seized by colonists. Sacred sites were destroyed and turned into farmland. Families who'd lived in the same place for countless generations were forced to leave again and again. But the theft of land wasn't the only horror. The diseases kept coming. Smallpox, measles, and diphtheria. Wave after wave. By 1640, New England's indigenous population had fallen from an estimated 100,000 before European contact to fewer than 10,000. In 1636, tensions between English settlers and the Pequot Nation exploded into war. The immediate cause was the death of 2 English traders, killed under murky circumstances that may not have even involved the Pequot. But the real cause was land. The Pequot controlled prime territory along the Connecticut River. The English wanted it. The Pequot War lasted less than a year. It changed everything. The English colonists allied with the Narragansett and the Mohegan, traditional rivals of the Pequot. This wasn't a simple story of Europeans versus Native Americans. This was complicated and brutal politics. And it culminated in one of the most horrific massacres in American history. May 26, 1637, Before dawn, a force of English soldiers and their native allies surrounded a fortified Pequot village at Mystic, Connecticut. Inside were approximately 400 to 700 people, mostly women, children, and elderly. The warriors were away. The English commander, Captain John Mason, had a plan. He didn't want to take prisoners. He didn't want a negotiated surrender. He wanted extermination. The soldiers surrounded the village's 2 exits. Then they burned everything to the ground. They awoke to fire and chaos. As they tried to escape, they were shot, then cut down with blades. Those who stayed inside burned alive. William Bradford, the governor of Plymouth Colony, the same man who'd written about that 1621 harvest feast, described what happened. It was a fearful sight to see them thus frying in the fire, and the streams of blood quenching the same, and horrible was the stink and scent thereof. But the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice, and they gave praise thereof to God. Between 400 and 700 people died. The massacre lasted less than an hour. Some of the English colonists' own native allies were horrified. A Narragansett warrior was recorded saying it was too furious and slays too many men. But the English weren't done. They hunted down the survivors, sold them into slavery in the Caribbean, scattered families to the wind. They killed the Pequot sachem, Sassacus. They outlawed the Pequot name, divided their territory among the victors. They tried to erase the Pequot from existence. Then, the Massachusetts Bay Colony governor ordered a day of Thanksgiving to celebrate the massacre. A day of Thanksgiving to celebrate the burning alive of hundreds of women and children. This wasn't the only massacre. It was the template. Again and again, the pattern repeated. Conflict, violence, slaughter. English victories followed by official days of Thanksgiving. Massasoit died in 1661. He'd kept the peace for 40 years through sheer force of will and political genius. His son, Metacom, called King Philip by the English, inherited a catastrophe. The Wampanoag had been reduced to a fraction of their former population. Their land had been almost entirely seized. English colonists outnumbered them 20 to 1, and the colonists were demanding that native people give up their sovereignty entirely, convert to Christianity, live under English law, abandon their culture. In 1675, Metacom decided enough was enough. He organized a coalition, Wampanoag, Nipmuc, Narragansett, Abenaki, and went to war to defend what little remained. King Philip's War lasted 14 months. It was the bloodiest war per capita in American history. Entire towns were burned on both sides. Thousands died. The violence was apocalyptic, and the English won. Metacom was killed in August 1676. They cut off his head and mounted it on a pike in Plymouth, where it remained for 25 years. They cut his body into quarters and hung them in trees. They captured his wife and 9-year-old son and sold them into slavery in the Caribbean. By the end of King Philip's War, the indigenous population of southern New England was effectively destroyed. Survivors were enslaved, scattered, driven north, or confined to tiny reservations. The Wampanoag, the Narragansett, the Nipmuc nations that had thrived for thousands of years were shattered. But this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. For the next 3 centuries, the pattern continued. Treaties signed and broken, land stolen, forced relocations, massacres. The Trail of Tears in the 1830s, when the Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw were forcibly marched thousands of miles west. Thousands died. The Long Walk of the Navajo in 1864. Forced march. Concentration camp. Death. The Sand Creek Massacre in 1864. Cheyenne and Arapaho, mostly women and children, slaughtered by U.S. cavalry. Wounded Knee in 1890. Lakota families gunned down. 200 dead, many of them women and children. And beyond the massacres, there was cultural genocide. Beginning in 1860 and continuing into the 1970s, Native children were forcibly taken from their families and sent to government boarding schools. The stated purpose, articulated by the founder of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School: kill the Indian, save the man. Children had their hair cut, a profound violation in many Native cultures. They were forbidden from speaking their languages, beaten if they practiced their religions, stripped of their names and given English ones. Thousands died in these schools. Thousands more were irreparably traumatized. The last boarding school didn't close until 1978. So when we talk about the destruction of Indigenous people, we're not talking about ancient history. We're talking about living memory. There are Native elders alive today who were taken from their families as children, who had their languages beaten out of them, who survived genocide. So how did we get from genocide to turkey dinners? How did mass graves become a fairy tale about a shared feast? The Thanksgiving myth as we know it was deliberately constructed in the 1800s. For most of American history, nobody cared about the Pilgrims. They were a minor footnote. The founding mythology of America centered on the Revolutionary War and the Founding Fathers. But in 1841, a man named Alexander Young published a book called Chronicles of the Pilgrim Fathers. In a footnote, he casually referred to the 1621 harvest feast as the first Thanksgiving. It caught on. By the mid-1800s, a magazine editor named Sarah Josepha Hall was lobbying every president to make Thanksgiving a national holiday. She wrote editorials, letters, articles, all promoting this vision of pilgrims and Indians sharing a peaceful meal. And here's the context. This was the era of manifest destiny. The United States was pushing west, seizing millions of acres of indigenous land, fighting brutal wars against native nations from the Great Plains to the Southwest. A country needed a story that justified this. A creation myth that made the displacement and destruction of native peoples seem natural, inevitable, even divinely ordained. The Thanksgiving myth did exactly that. It rewrote first contact as peaceful cooperation. It suggested that native people willingly helped colonizers and then just faded away, disappeared into history. It turned genocide into a fairy tale. In 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln declared Thanksgiving a national holiday. His proclamation called for Americans to give thanks even in the midst of war. It was meant to unite a fractured nation. But here's what Lincoln's proclamation doesn't mention: Native people. The very same year, Lincoln declared Thanksgiving a national holiday. He ordered the largest mass execution in U.S. history. 38 Dakota men hanged in Minnesota. By the early 1900s, the Thanksgiving myth was everywhere. In schoolrooms, children performed plays about pilgrims and Indians. Norman Rockwell painted his iconic Freedom from Want in 1943. A white family gathered around a turkey, the image of American prosperity. And every year, the myth grew stronger, more sanitized, more comfortable, until the truth was almost completely buried. In 1970, the same year as the first Earth Day, the same year as the Kent State shootings, the same year the voting age dropped to 18, America was waking up, questioning everything. And Native Americans were organizing. The American Indian movement was gaining momentum. Native people were demanding treaty rights, sovereignty, recognition. And that November, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts decided to celebrate the 350th anniversary of the Pilgrims' landing with a big ceremony at Plymouth. They invited a Wampanoag man named Frank James, known as Wamsutta, to speak at the event. Frank James was an elder, a veteran, a member of the Wampanoag tribe of Gay Head, known now as Aquina. He took the invitation seriously. He wrote a speech, an honest speech. He wrote about what the arrival of the Mayflower had actually meant for his people, about the diseases, the land theft, and the massacres, about survival and resistance. He submitted the speech to the organizers in advance, as requested. They told him he couldn't deliver it. Too controversial, too negative, not appropriate for a celebration. They wanted him to deliver something else, something more palatable. Frank James refused. Instead, on Thanksgiving Day 1970, he gathered with a small group of native people on Coles Hill, overlooking Plymouth Rock, and he gave his speech anyway. Today is a time of celebrating for you, but it is not a time of celebrating for me. It is with heavy heart that I look back upon what happened to my people. We, the Wampanoag, welcomed you, the white man, with open arms, little knowing that it was the beginning of the end. Before 50 years were to pass, the Wampanoag would no longer be a free people. That gathering became the National Day of Mourning. Every year since 1970, on Thanksgiving, Native people from across the country gather at Plymouth. They march, they speak, they remember. They mourn the ancestors lost to disease and violence. They mourn languages that fell silent, traditions broken, children stolen. But they also celebrate survival. Because despite everything, despite the genocide, the forced relocations, the boarding schools, the relentless attempts to erase them, they are still here. The National Day of Mourning isn't just about the past. It's about the present. Native people today are fighting for sovereignty, for treaty rights, for sacred sites, for clean water. Fighting to revitalize languages on the brink of extinction. Fighting to bring their children home from unmarked graves at boarding schools. The struggle that began in 1620 hasn't ended. The Wampanoag Nation still exists. They never disappeared. They're still in Massachusetts, fighting for federal recognition, for sovereignty, for their ancestral lands. The Pequot Nation still exists. After being declared extinct, they reorganized, reclaimed their identity, fought for, and won federal recognition. The Narragansett, the Nipmuc, the Mohegan, they're all still here. Across this continent, 574 federally recognized tribes and countless more state-recognized or unrecognized nations continue to exist, speaking their languages, practicing their traditions, fighting for their rights. They survived. Against odds that would have destroyed any other people, they survived. The story of Thanksgiving isn't over. It's still being written. The question is, what story will we tell?